Sadat thought his dramatic gesture would break the logjam, but discussions dragged on through the winter and spring of 1974. In July, a frustrated Sadat suspended negotiations. Then, President Carter stepped in and invited Sadat and Begin to his presidential retreat at Camp David to resume negotiating. The talks lasted 13 days.
The role of Jimmy Carter in the making of Camp David was essential because you had this very difficult customer, Menachem Begin, and you had this Egyptian president who believed that his diplomacy, that his trip to Jerusalem was this great unmatched event in human history. And so the expectations of Sadat were sky high, and the willingness of Menachem Begin to make concessions was quite limited.
One of the real talents of Sadat was that he could break through the normal way of thinking about things. He often surprised his own people by accepting things that Begin had proposed, which they would have lawyered to death, but Sadat took them and agreed to them. And so there was a constant tension. Half the negotiations were between the Egyptians and Sadat. The other half were between Sadat and Begin.
On the 13th day, President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin signed what were known as the Camp David Accords.
Camp David negotiations had two separate agreements. One was related to Israeli withdrawal and Egyptian-Israeli peace, and the other was related to an autonomy for the Palestinians that ultimately was going to lead to a state. And that second never materialized.
For their historic agreement, Sadat and Begin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978, and Time magazine named Sadat its Man of the Year. Sadat had become an international superstar. Anwar Sadat's greatest achievement came on March 26, 1979, when he and Prime Minister Begin signed an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty.
The peace treaty was the culmination of what Sadat had been going after, which was the total return of the Sinai. He proved that he had restored what Nasser had lost. He proved that he was no longer Nasser's lapdog and that he had restored Egyptian pride.
Sadat's quest for peace dramatically altered the dynamics of war and peace in the Middle East.
There can be no war. There can be no big Arab-Israeli war without Egypt. This was the strategic importance of Egypt. He was removing the largest Arab army. With Egypt leaving the Arab-Israeli wars, the age of the major Arab-Israeli wars came to an end.
Sadat had hoped Egypt would reap great rewards in the wake of the peace treaty, but he was mistaken. In the Arab world, Sadat was vilified for failing to resolve the Palestinian issue. Many Arabs felt he had sold them out.
This was an ultimate act of dishonoring oneself. It was an ultimate act of surrender for many, many Arabs. They believed that he was trading away Egypt's advantages. He was walking away from the Palestinians. He was opting for a separate peace.
Sadat knew that an Egyptian peace agreement without resolution of the Palestinian issue would be unpopular among Arabs. But he didn't realize how unpopular.
He didn't expect that all the Arabs were going to boycott Egypt or basically cut relations with Egypt or expel Egypt from the Arab League.
The Arab boycott increased tensions between Sadat and his people. Many Egyptians who had been working in Arab countries and were an important source of income for their families were expelled and forced to return home where there were no jobs. Frustration over the lack of jobs was especially strong at the universities.
These university graduates and students who you would have assumed would have been able to foresee prosperity under this new regime were so disenchanted with the system that they turned, as was the case during the early days of Christianity, to the church, to the Muslim fundamentalist movement.
Universities became a hotbed of fundamentalist activities. Women adopted the traditional headdress. In class, they sat apart from the men. campuses doubled as recruitment sites for Islamic activists.
Muslim fundamentalism, which would come to haunt Egypt and haunt the world in years to come, had begun to make inroads into the society. And there were pitched battles at one point in Cairo and in other parts of Egypt between the Copts, the Christians of the country, and the Muslim fundamentalists.
Sadat had originally tolerated the spread of Muslim fundamentalism as a counterbalance to other political opposition groups. But after the signing of the peace treaty and Sadat's rise to international stardom, he and the fundamentalists found themselves increasingly at odds.
The last 2-3 years of Anwar Sadat's life were about this juxtaposition between the stardom of Anwar Sadat abroad and the dissatisfaction of Egyptians with his regime.
There were real pockets of opposition and hostility that simply grew during this period, and they were able to use these attributes, his beautifully tailored suits, his Pierre Cardin uniforms, his multiple palaces, which were beautiful, by the way. They were able to use it against him and to start to break down his reputation.
Islamic fundamentalists argued that he had been seduced by the bright lights of foreign lands, that he was estranged from his people and preferred the company of international celebrities.
He loved welcoming Elizabeth Taylor to Egypt. Well, she had once played Cleopatra, so she was on familiar ground. He loved being with Walter Cronkite. He loved being with Barbara Walters. He took to America. America was very seductive to him.
In conservative, traditional Egypt, Jihan Sadat, Sadat's socially progressive wife, was even more controversial than her husband.
Jihan Sadat was a believer in women's rights. She wanted to turn around the life of the average woman in the Egyptian society. And so she went out and publicly talked about women's rights, about equality, about family planning. All of this was anathema to the established hierarchy among the males of Egypt.
Hostility toward Sadat intensified in 1979 after Islamic revolutionaries overthrew Sadat's friend, the pro-Western Shah of Iran. Placing friendship above politics, Sadat offered the ailing Shah political asylum in Egypt.
So things were quite difficult for him, and Egypt was becoming an increasingly bitter and unhappy country. And Sadat himself was spending more and more time away from Cairo. He hated the Cairenes. He hated the intellectuals. He hated the journalists. And he developed this fantasy of peasant Egypt. He would go back to his village.
But the serenity of the village was no cure for what ailed him. Sadat had always kept his own counsel. Now he was isolated and growing increasingly agitated. In September 1981, bloody rioting broke out between Egypt's Muslim fundamentalists and its Coptic Christian minority. In response, Sadat ordered the imprisonment of some 1,500 people.